Hello everyone, and welcome to the sixth lecture in the course, and our final lecture on drugs and the brain. So I want to begin this lecture by talking about the discussion questions from last week. As before, the comments were very good, very insightful, very well considered. So I'll go over what some of the common responses were, and I'll give my own response to them. Uh, so there was a question about chemical synaptic transmission, about why neurons would convert an electrical signal into a chemical signal, and then the receiving neuron, the postsynaptic neuron, would convert that chemical signal back into an electrical one. Why the conversion? Why not just stay electrical throughout? Uh, One of those common comments was that this is efficient. This is true and not true in certain ways. So it's efficient uh, in terms of the fact that if neurons have an electrical connection, and they do sometimes, uh, if that transmission is directly electrical, the signal gets weaker the more neurons it goes through. And so you would have to have some sort of process in place to amplify that signal periodically in order to get the same the same transmission from one neuron to another. Uh, so it's efficient in that way. You don't have to keep on amplifying the signal. It's inefficient in the sense that it takes more time to be certain. It takes longer for synaptic vesicles to fuse to the membrane, release neurotransmitter. That neurotransmitter goes across the synaptic cleft, binds to the postsynaptic receptors. So all that takes more time than just a simple electrical impulse. Um, it's also expensive energetically to create those neurotransmitter molecules and put them into vesicles and then sort of keep things ready in case an active needle comes down the line, and then release everything and break it down or recreate new molecules. So it's energy intensive, and it's not very fast, but it does keep neurons from having to periodically amplify their signals. One of the comments that was made was also that it's modifiable, and this is really one of the strengths of chemical signaling, is that you have this modifiable signal. You can increase the amount of enzyme in the synaptic cleft. You can change the number of receptors on the postsynaptic end. You can change how many vesicles are present. There are lots of things you can change to alter the strength of that signal, to alter the character of that signal. Um, and so that's one of the big advantages. Is the complexity of the system is also its strength because it allows multiple points at which you can modify the signal that's coming down the line, so to speak. It also allows a variety of signals. What do I mean? I mean, you have things like glutamate and GABA. These are both neurotransmitters. If you were in a purely electrical setup, then all you have is the signal that was present in the previous neuron, in the presynaptic neuron. You can't make that stream of ions, is all it really is. You can't make that somehow inhibitory. Whereas glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter. The receptors it binds to let in sodium, but GABA is a neurotransmitter, but it binds to receptors that let in chloride, and so they have very different effects. And it's hard to imagine if it was just an electrical impulse how you would sort of invert the voltage of that electrical impulse to where it was inhibitory on the second neuron, where it was excitatory in the first. And so you can send a variety of signals that way. And again, they should be very modifiable by virtue of that chemical synapse. Okay, the other question was in reference to the concept of my brain made me do it. So the question was, our brains are biological systems, so our neurons are biological systems, and our brains ultimately determine our behavior. So if we have certain genes that control how our neurons function, to what degree are we responsible for drug use behavior? And a concept that came up over and over again is free will, the idea that we are responsible for our actions. And this is a very old idea. Uh, and a lot of responses came in the form of, well, your genes may govern your dependence susceptibility. So once you start using a drug, uh, you may be more susceptible to it by virtue of your genes. but that using a drug in the first place is under your control, and so therefore you're responsible for taking the drug in the first place and all the consequences that occur afterwards. Of course, we're not always able to anticipate all the consequences of our actions. Uh, that gets into a philosophical concept called moral luck, where we tend to assign blame for consequences, even when those consequences weren't under our control or foreseeable. The classic example is you have two drunk drivers. One blows through a red light and continues on toward his home. The other blows through a red light and runs over a pedestrian. Now, of course, the decision to get drunk and then drive was arguably under the control of the individual. The presence or absence of the pedestrian was not, and yet we assign more blame to the second individual than the first. So that's a concept that comes up in our legal system, certainly. But getting back to the idea of free will, that we are responsible for our actions, it's a very tempting concept. It's very alluring. And of course, our legal system depends to a certain degree on it. The question is, do we really have free will in any circumstance, not just when it comes to drug use? And again, this is a philosophical debate more than anything. But there is evidence that has been brought to bear recently. It depends on how you define free will. So, for example, if you have a person going through their life, and I can write down ahead of time all the decisions they're going to make, the fact that I can predict it, for some people, it suggests that we don't have free will. If something can be predicted, then it must not have been a free choice. Now, some schools of philosophy say, no, you can have prediction and not interfere with free will. But there is, for example, neuroscientific evidence that we can determine which decision you're going to make between two options before you're even aware of having made a decision, seconds before. So not a long time. It's not like we can write down the course of your life. But if we can anticipate the decision you're going to make, that sensation that I've made this decision for myself, and that it wasn't determined beforehand, it calls that sensation into question. So the idea of free will, again, is a very old idea, but does it really exist? That is sort of an open question, and it is one of the most troubling in philosophy and science, especially when it comes to how do we decide responsibility for actions. And again, this was brought up mainly in the context of dependence being genetically determined to some degree, while initiation was not. So one other question is, are genes, again, this is a tempting idea to say, well, we should know that we're susceptible if we know our genetics, that we're susceptible to drug use, and that we shouldn't initiate the drug use. Of course, these things happen gradually or under social circumstances we may not control. But more importantly, you may actually have genetic factors that lead you to try new things, and there's evidence for this. I don't want to go so far as saying there's definitely an addictive personality, but there are personality traits like what's called novelty seeking, which is like thrill seeking. You're looking for new experiences, and that varies from person to person, and it seems to have a genetic component. So it's tempting to say that initiating a drug use is totally under our control, but again, it may have a genetic component as well. And as always, I'm not arguing for one side or the other. I'm just bringing things to our attention so that we can further the debate and perhaps consider aspects of behavior that we hadn't considered before, and bring some scientific evidence into the debate. So what does this mean for our legal system? Well, that's difficult. Again, we have this idea that we are responsible for our actions. And what do we do if someone has a genetic predisposition or is coming from an environment that predisposes them toward drug use? And they may not have any control over a lot of aspects of that environment. Their parental environment, maybe the environment in which they were raised, for example. And unfortunately, our legal system, not that it's entirely, none that it's not understandable, but often exists in sort of a binary sense. Someone is responsible for their action here, or they're not. So we have things like an insanity defense, someone wasn't responsible for their actions because they didn't know the difference between right and wrong, or this person was responsible for taking this drug and therefore is liable for the consequences. Now um, that is very convenient for the legal system, but of course it may not be as black or white as that. It may not be that the most accurate depiction of reality is in those binary terms. It may be that somebody is 90% responsible for what they were doing, whereas someone else is only 60%. Um, so we have to draw sort of an artificial line with someone responsible or not, when in fact there could be degrees of responsibility. So when we say that someone's responsible for whether they use drugs, where do we draw that line? So if they're 100% responsible, does that mean that they have 100, that they retain full ability to stop themselves from taking a drug? What if that's 95%? What if it's 70%? So a lot of characteristics in our behavior and our psychology exist on a spectrum. So where do we come down on someone is responsible or not? How do we transform this variety of variables that comprise a person and their personality and their behavior? How do we distill that down into this binary distinction? And maybe we don't have to. Uh, so anyway, so just some things to think about. Again, some very interesting comments were made, and keep up the good work. Okay, so by way of overview, as before, we're looking at drugs and what they do to the brain. And we've already looked at neurons and even multiple neurons put together in synapses. And last time we started talking about the brain as a whole. And we'll start talking about the brain again in this session. But again, we've already sort of covered the parts of the brain. Now we'll talk about the brain in the context really of the entire body. So in this session in particular, what we're going to do is start talking about categories of drugs. This is going to frame sort of the rest of the course. The next couple of weeks, we'll talk about things like drug regulation, drug policy, and after that, we'll start talking about individual drugs. So this is sort of framing that setup. We'll learn about the various methods of administration, routes of administration. That is, how do we get drugs into the body? And then we'll talk about some of the long-term effects of drug use, things like tolerance. How does tolerance develop? Why does tolerance develop? And so that's going to be this lecture. Next week, we'll start talking about drug use and its social implications, in addition to its biological ones. Okay, so there are lots of drugs. There are lots of substances that affect behavior. And there are so many, it's hard to keep them all in mind. So one convenient thing to do is categorize them. So how do we categorize that? What system do we use? On what basis do we classify a drug? Do we look at its chemical structure? That is, its molecular configuration. There are a lot of drugs that are very similar to one another chemically. And oftentimes they have similar effects. But is it the chemistry that we should focus on? Or is it the behavioral effects? Is it what the person's behavior, what their perception becomes as a result of using the drug? Its purpose. So some drugs may have a variety of effects, and another drug may have very limited effects, but they're intended for the same thing. They can both be pain relievers. Some pain relievers have more effects than others. So do we categorize them by what they're intended for? What about their legality? So that's sort of a social perspective. Do we talk about drugs and categorize them based on whether they're legal or not? So for our purposes in this course, we will talk about the legality of drugs, but just as a framework for describing different drugs, that's not as useful, primarily because laws change over time and they change from place to place. So categorize them by legal or illegal, by that distinction, isn't a very rich explanation. Again, it's sort of a binary explanation. And there are lots of different drugs and lots of different things that drugs do. And here we're interested really in behavior. This is a drugs and behavior course. So what we're going to do is categorize drugs for our purposes by effect. What the drug does to the body, to the brain, to behavior. And if we do that, we come up with a variety of categories. So your book here has 7, and these are 7 pretty common categories. They're the stimulants that increase excitability, increase wakefulness, alertness. These are things like cocaine, which is not legal, and caffeine, which is. There are depressants, and these really have a wide variety of forms, chemically speaking. There's something as simple as alcohol, ethanol, very simple molecule, wide variety of effects. Other things like Valium, which is a benzodiazepine. Chemically very different from alcohol, but has these depressant effects. It increases restfulness, relaxation, sleepiness, to varying degrees, but this is something that's common to depressants. There are opioids, and opioids are called opioids because they're chemical derivatives of opium and the chemicals contained in opium. And we'll talk about that. We have a whole unit on opioids. But these are pain relieving agents. There are hallucinogens. So these, as the name suggests, produce things that are technically not hallucinations. They're more sensory modifications, but they're called hallucinogens, so we'll go with it. And these are things like LSD, psilocybin, things that perturb usually our visual perception. There are psychotherapeutics that are used to alleviate mental disorders and mood disorders especially. There are a lot of things like antidepressants, but also things like antipsychotics, things that relieve symptoms of disorders like schizophrenia. Nicotine is sort of a category unto itself. In many ways it is a stimulant, but in some important ways it also has effects with depressants. People take cigarettes, use cigarettes, both to have those excitatory effects, but also to relax. So this combination, this unusual combination of effects in the case of nicotine and smoking. There's also marijuana. Marijuana has sort of a combination of effects. It is historically sometimes classified as a depressant, but in sufficient quantities it can act as a hallucinogen. So again, it has this combination of effects, so we kind of put it in its own category. And of course, there's not just the category that a drug belongs to, there's also what we call it. So there are naming conventions, and fortunately for biochemists and pharmaceutical companies, there are a variety of names that are convenient for them. Unfortunately for us, it means the same substance has a variety of names that we sometimes have to be aware of. So there are different names for a drug. There is its chemical name. So this is a description of the chemical substance. So diacetylmorphine, for example. So that indicates that it's a morphine molecule that has 2 acetyl groups attached to it. But unless you're a chemist, that's not very accessible. So the company that develops the drug will often have a generic name that's a little bit simpler. And so if you see commercials for pharmaceuticals, you'll often hear 2 names. Things like Tylenol, we'll get to that in a second, but the generic name is acetaminophen. That is the convenient name for the chemical. Now the chemical name itself is more complex, doesn't need to concern us here. But there's the generic name, which is just the name that pharmaceutical companies use to refer to that substance. There's also the brand name. So the name that the drug is marketed under. And of course, competing companies can have the same drug and have different names for it. But anyway, we have diacetylmorphine, a chemical. The generic name is diamorphine. The brand name is heroin. Many people don't know that heroin was actually a brand name. The Bayer company, the same company that makes aspirin, developed heroin. They chemically modified morphine and named it heroin. And it was sold commercially. Most people think of heroin as a generic name or a chemical name or even just a street name. But it was, in fact, a brand name. It was marketed under the name heroin. Now, of course, Bayer doesn't make a big deal when people use the term and don't refer to Bayer's trademark. They're not going to push that issue. But heroin is a brand name, technically speaking. Of course, there are also things, especially for illicit drugs, like street names. So heroin is referred to as smack or H or a number of names I'm sure I'm not aware of. But This is another way of referring to the same substance. So we have all these different ways of referring to a drug, and it's all the same thing. It just depends on the context. And of course, to make things even more complicated, we often have names for naturally occurring substances, things like tobacco, where the active ingredient, the main active ingredient is nicotine, which is the chemical name. But tobacco is the name of the natural product that's most visible. That's also true for things like opium, which is actually a mixture of chemicals. Okay, so that's it for categorizing drugs. Again, that's going to sort of frame our course, at least the last 2/3 of the course, when we talk about individual drugs. Now we're going to move on to routes of administration. What does that mean? Well, basically, it's how the drug is introduced to the bloodstream. All drugs have to go into the blood. That's really the most reasonable way of distributing them to the body and to the brain. So your book has this diagram about various ways of getting drugs into the bloodstream. Now, even if a drug has an effect on the brain, it's not very reasonable to inject it directly into the brain. Even if you do, what it's really doing is entering the blood supply. You don't want to have to inject the quantity of drug into each individual neuron that you care about. Although technology like that are always developing, getting more targeted administration to individual portions of the brain, for example. But for now, all drugs are administered via the bloodstream. So there are various ways of getting those drugs in. You can inject them directly, either directly into the bloodstream, what's called intravenous injection. You can inject them into a muscle, intramuscular injection, or you can inject them just under the skin, subcutaneous injection. Sub from under, cutaneous meaning pertaining to the skin. So subcutaneous means under the skin. So 3 different ways of injecting a substance, and we'll talk about the differences there in terms of its effects. You can also breathe in a drug. There's what's called insufflation, which is just a way of saying snorting, putting it in the nose. There are a lot of blood vessels in the nasal cavity, and the drug can get absorbed through those mucous membranes into the bloodstream. You can also, of course, inhale it. This is usually through smoking. There are also inhalants that aren't smoked. They're not burned before being inhaled. But there's a lot of blood supply to the lungs. And it turns out that smoking, that inhaling a substance, is perhaps the fastest way to get it to the brain. Because as you can see from this diagram, whereas injecting something into a vein, once it's in the vein, it has to go to the heart, then it goes to the lungs, then it goes to the other side of the heart, and then it goes to the rest of the body. That can take a while. If you inhale it, that's getting directly into the blood, and it's getting directly into the oxygenated blood that goes straight into the heart and then to the rest of the body. So it's very quick, which is why smoking is a very fast way of drugs into the system. So you can smoke it, you can snort, insufflate, or inhale a substance. And in addition to injecting, of course, one of the most common ways is just to ingest it, swallowing a pill, for example. And so from there it goes in the stomach and usually into the small intestine where it's absorbed. Now that's a much slower process, as we all know. It often takes a while for pills to have their effect, even if they're touted as being very, very quick. So all of this is to say that the way we get drugs in the system is by introducing them one way or another into the bloodstream. But these different methods have different advantages and disadvantages, so to speak, different effects when it comes to how quickly a drug is absorbed and what the risks are. And of course, something may be an advantage if you're taking in an appropriate amount of a drug. If you're taking in too much, then a fast delivery of the drug isn't so helpful. In fact, that becomes a disadvantage. But this table from your book labels them as such, and so we'll go over this. As I mentioned, you can take a drug orally, and that can be a slow process, but it's usually pretty safe because it's slow. You're not rushing a bunch of drugs into the system all at once. So once it's absorbed, also, drugs that are taken orally are processed by the liver. And so if you have a drug that is deactivated by the liver, then the oral intake method is not really an option. Uh, but you can put things directly into the blood, bypass the liver. Again, insufflation, very quick. Inhalation, very quick. Um, a little difficult to control the amount, which is why it's not a very common way for uh, pharmaceuticals to be administered uh, in a hospital setting, for example. You don't snort very many prescription drugs. At least that's not recommended by the doctor. Um, Also because uh, it's potentially toxic to the lungs, to the nasal cavity, so on. Uh, Similarly for injection. So if you inject something just into the skin, if you use a subcutaneous injection, uh, if it's irritating or even damaging to the skin, you can have what's called necrosis, which is just the death of tissue around the site of injection. So that's obviously not something you want. Uh, so the subcutaneous and intramuscular injections tend to be slower. Intravenous is typically more rapid, but not as rapid as inhalation. So a lot of these methods vary in terms of how quickly the drug will get into the system. Uh, Also, whether it'll be metabolized by the liver, and what the effects are if the substance is toxic in some way. There are also other routes, things like direct contact on the skin, um, and you can also absorb uh, drugs in the form of things like suppositories, which are obviously taken in through the intestines. But these aren't very common. We're not really going to dwell on them very much. But these are other routes that are possible depending on the drug. Some drugs are not absorbed very well through the skin, for example. Many drugs aren't. Okay, so some other factors in the effects that drugs have are how easily the drug binds to proteins in the blood. If they really bind to those proteins, then the drug is going to be circulating around in the blood for a longer time. Whereas if they don't bind very easily, then it's going to be metabolized or absorbed into cells very easily because it's not attached to those blood proteins. And so that can determine how long the drug stays resident in the bloodstream. And it's important for things like drug interactions. If you're taking multiple drugs at once, if you've taken a drug that doesn't have much affinity for those blood proteins, and then you take another drug that does have an affinity, then suddenly the high affinity drug is going to displace the low one, and now there's all this uh, free drug roaming around that got displaced from blood proteins, and so now you have this sort of bump up in the effective concentration of a drug because you've taken the second one, and that can really alter the effects on behavior and the effects on the riskiness of the drug. There's also the blood-brain barrier. So most of the body, it's pretty easy to get a drug into the body from the bloodstream. The blood-brain barrier is just what it sounds like. It's an extra layer of protection the brain has. It makes it harder to get drugs into the brain. However, drugs that are more lipid soluble, that is, they dissolve in things like oils and fats as opposed to water, uh, the more lipid soluble substances, the easier it usually is to get it into the brain. So heroin gets into the brain much more easily than morphine does, for example, because heroin is more lipid soluble. It's been chemically modified to where it's more what's called lipophilic. It dissolves more easily in fats and oils than it does in water. And so that's an issue for drug development, is not just developing a drug that's effective once it's in the brain, but getting it into the brain in the first place. There are also what are called non-specific, usually placebo effects. And we've already talked about how expectations can play a role in the effects that a drug has. And then the placebo effect is an example of that exact phenomenon. So you can give someone a sugar pill, something totally inert, and yet they will often experience the effect, whether it's relief from pain or relief from depression. They'll often experience relief from the phenomenon because they expect to get it. So what do you have to do to really assess how effective a drug is? You have to measure these non-specific effects. So what you usually do is use what's called the double-blind procedure. which is where you have two groups of participants, one who are getting the actual drug and one who are getting a placebo. And so some of the placebo group are going to report an effect because they're expecting one. But the difference between the drug group and the placebo group, you can subtract out the effect of those expectations because both groups are expecting some effect, but the drug group will have some additional effect as a result of actually getting the drug. That may not be a big one, in which case the drug isn't all that effective, but it's measurable. Okay, so once a drug has gotten into the system, and once it's had its effect, what happens after that? Well, there's a phenomenon of drug deactivation, which is just a way of saying how the drug stops working. And the only way for that to happen is if the drug leaves the body somehow. So as long as the drug is in the bloodstream intact, it's going to keep on having an effect. So one way to get rid of it is just to excrete the drug as is. So amphetamines, for example, don't get modified in any way. You just excrete it through the urine. So that's how amphetamines stop having their effect, is you take them, they circulate in the blood, around the bloodstream, have their effect on the body and the brain, but gradually the kidneys filter them out and excrete them. The other way is to turn the drug into what are called metabolites, which is just the chemical byproducts of being broken down. And then those metabolites are excreted. So sometimes a drug itself is not easy to excrete. The kidneys can only excrete certain kinds of things. But the liver is the main organ in the body that metabolizes drugs. The liver will turn it into something that can be excreted. This brings up the idea of what are called active metabolites. Sometimes a drug will be metabolized by the liver, and then what it turns the drug into still has an effect. So alcohol actually is an example. Alcohol itself has an effect, but then the byproducts of breaking down alcohol have an effect as well, and it's those byproducts that actually produce things like a hangover. It's not the alcohol itself, it's the metabolites. And so these are active metabolites because they have an effect on behavior as well. Some metabolites are inert. Once the drug gets broken down, the metabolites don't have any effect, they get excreted, and that's that. But some drugs can turn into active metabolites. And in fact, some drug development works on having a substance that isn't initially effective, but that the liver turns into something that is. So it's not the drug itself that's first administered, it's the byproducts of metabolism that are effective on behavior. As I mentioned, metabolism usually accomplished by the liver, so that's your main organ for breaking down drugs and other toxic substances. And drugs can actually have an activating effect on the liver, so they can sort of enhance their own breakdown. So the liver has enzymes, which are molecules that break down substances. We've already met them in the topic of synaptic transmission, where they break down neurotransmitters. But drugs can affect the enzymes as well. Now, sometimes drugs can affect just those enzymes. They're not really going to affect behavior in that case, except insofar as those enzymes then break down other drugs. But a drug itself, things like alcohol, can increase the activity of these enzymes and enhance their own metabolism. So a drug can sort of initiate its own demise in the bloodstream. Okay, so tolerance. Now, once a drug has been absorbed in the bloodstream, taken up by the body and the brain, and then broken down, what about long-term effects? What about repeated usage? Well, one of the effects of repeated usage is what's called tolerance. And that just means the diminishing effect of a drug after you keep on using it. So if you keep the amount constant, the dosage, it'll have less and less of an effect. Or another way of saying that is, to get the same effect, you have to keep taking more and more of the drug, an increasing dosage. And so tolerance comes in a variety of forms. One of them is what's called drug disposition tolerance, otherwise known as metabolic tolerance or pharmacokinetic tolerance. And what that means is that the drug, for example, gets broken down more easily. So the liver starts making more enzyme that breaks the drug down. and so the drug is cleared from the system more quickly. There's also behavioral tolerance, and this again touches on the idea of expectations. So once you get used to taking a drug, it may not have the same effect on your behavior as it did before, because you can anticipate its effects and, in some ways, counteract them behaviorally. So the more accustomed you are to drinking alcohol, the more it takes, not just because your body breaks down alcohol more easily, but also because you can anticipate the loss of balance and coordination, the slurring of speech, for example, poor judgment. You can anticipate these things, and now it takes even more alcohol to get that same breakdown in your behavior. There's also what's called pharmacodynamic or functional tolerance. And this is where there's an actual change in the chemistry of the neurons. So the more of a drug that's administered, the neurons can actually change what receptors are on the dendrites. So if a lot of, for example, nicotine is being administered, the dendrites can put less and less receptors, fewer and fewer receptors on those dendritic terminals, those spines. And so now it's less sensitive to nicotine. So what do? You have to get more nicotine into the system to get the same effect, because the system has reduced how sensitive it is to the drug. And this can happen in a variety of ways. But those are the three main forms of tolerance: are drug disposition tolerance, where the body breaks the substance down; behavioral, where the change in behavior is anticipated; and pharmacodynamic, where the chemistry of the neurons changes to where they're less sensitive to the drug. And pharmacodynamic, that last form of tolerance, is mainly what's responsible for withdrawal symptoms. So if the brain comes to expect, so to speak, a certain amount of morphine in the system, then once that morphine is taken away, instead of being sensitive to pain at a normal level, because the system is accommodated, has gotten used to the amount of morphine in the system, now you can be super sensitive to pain once that morphine is taken away. And so you get things like the opposite of the effect that the drug usually has. And so you have increased sensitivity to pain under opioid withdrawal, for example. There's also a phenomenon of cross tolerance, which is a way of saying that we become tolerant to drugs in sort of family groups. So if I repeatedly use heroin, there's a good chance I'll become tolerant to morphine as well, even though chemically it's slightly different. It's similar enough that my sensitivity to a drug I haven't been using will depend on its similarity to drugs that I have been using. Okay, so that is it for this time. Next time, we will start talking about drug use in more of a social perspective. So we'll talk about things like drug toxicity, which occurs at an individual level but has social ramifications. We'll talk about models of dependence. So drug addiction has been around, drug dependence has been around, drug use has been around for a very long time. And so over the course of time, there have been various models, various theories about why drug dependence occurs. And so we'll go over some of those. Also, the relationship between drug use and crime. So crime is a social phenomenon stemming from drug use. To what degree, how tight is that linkage? So those are all things we'll talk about next week, and I will see you then.